The morning was one of those deceptively quiet ones in the kind of suburban neighborhood where every lawn is manicured to perfection, every mailbox painted to match the HOA's approved color palette, and every stranger is scrutinized like they're casing the joint. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and the lingering dew that hadn't yet burned off under the early April sun. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, until it did, and when it did, it wasn't just a ripple, but a full-blown tidal wave that would leave the cul-de-sac reeling for weeks. At the center of this particular storm was Karen Whitaker, a woman who wore her role as head of the neighborhood's homeowners association like a crown, albeit one forged from self-righteous indignation and an encyclopedic knowledge of bylaws. Karen was in her late 50s, with hair dyed a shade of blonde that screamed, "I'm not aging gracefully," and a wardrobe of pastel athleisure that she paired with fuzzy slippers, even when she was out policing the street for infractions. She was the kind of person who'd send a strongly worded email about a neighbor's trash can being left out an hour past pickup time, and she'd do it with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they were single-handedly holding civilization together. Her house, a two-story colonial with pristine white siding, was a monument to her control. Every shrub trimmed, every window gleaming, every blade of grass practically saluting her authority. That morning, Karen was up early, as she always was, sipping her second cup of decaf from a mug that read "Boss Lady" in glittery pink cursive. She stood at her kitchen window, peering through the blinds with the vigilance of a hawk, her eyes scanning the street for anything out of place. It was a ritual, one she'd perfected over years of being the neighborhood's unofficial watchdog. A kid's bike left on a lawn? She'd knock on the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A delivery truck lingering too long? She'd jot down the license plate and call the company to complain. Karen didn't just live in the neighborhood, she ruled it, and she'd made it her mission to ensure everyone else knew it. But this morning, something caught her eye that sent her into high alert. A black van, unmarked and sleek, rolled into the cul-de-sac with a quiet hum that didn't match the usual rumble of delivery trucks or the flashy sirens of an ambulance. It pulled up in front of the Whitaker house, her own house, though she didn't know it yet, and parked with a precision that seemed almost too deliberate. The van's windows were tinted, its exterior devoid of any logos or flashing lights, and to Karen, it screamed trouble. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. She'd seen videos on TikTok, shared in the neighborhood group chat, about scam vans posing as utility workers to rob houses. She'd read articles about human trafficking rings operating out of unmarked vehicles. And just last month, there'd been a break-in 2 streets over, which she'd used as justification to install a Ring doorbell and a motion sensor floodlight that annoyed everyone on the block. Who do they think they're fooling? Karen muttered to herself, setting her mug down with a clink. She grabbed her phone, already dialing 911, her fingers moving with the practiced speed of someone who'd made this call before. "This is a private neighborhood," she said under her breath, as if rehearsing her speech to the dispatcher. "We have rules." Across the street, inside the van, the scene was a stark contrast to Karen's brewing paranoia. The vehicle wasn't a criminal hideout or a scam operation, it was a state-of-the-art mobile ICU, part of a government-backed pilot program designed to respond to critical medical emergencies faster than traditional ambulances. Inside, the air was thick with the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. Monitors blinked with vital signs, oxygen tanks hissed softly, and a team of 2 paramedics worked with the kind of focus that only comes from knowing a life is slipping through their fingers. Ellie Harper, the lead paramedic, was a woman in her mid-30s with short-cropped dark hair and a calm intensity that made her seem unflappable, even in the face of chaos. She'd seen it all: gunshot wounds in war zones, car accidents on icy highways, heart attacks in crowded malls, and she'd learned to tune out the noise of the world when a patient's life was on the line. Her hands moved with surgical precision, adjusting in 4-line, dripping into the arm of Tom Whitaker, Karen's husband, who lay unconscious on the gurney. Tom was 62, with a shock of white hair and a face that looked peaceful despite the fact that his heart was teetering on the edge of failure. A wearable monitor strapped to his chest had sent an alert to the ICU van's satellite link when his vitals spiked erratically during his morning coffee, and now Ellie was fighting to keep him alive. "Pulse is thready," Ellie said, her voice steady but urgent. "We're losing him." Her partner, Chris Delgado, was younger, maybe late 20s, with a wiry build and a knack for staying calm under pressure. He was prepping the defibrillator, his fingers flying over the controls as he checked the charge. "AD's ready. Just say the word." The van's interior was a marvel of modern medicine, packed with equipment that rivaled a hospital trauma bay. A heart monitor blipped erratically, showing Tom's rhythm dipping into dangerous territory. Oxygen tanks were secured to the walls, their gauges glowing faintly in the dim light. 4 bags hung from a rack, each dripping a different medication into Tom's veins. The back doors of the van were open, revealing the chaos inside to anyone who bothered to look, but Karen wasn't looking. She was too busy pacing her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, her voice rising with every word. "Yes, hello, 911? This is Karen Whitaker, head of the Pine Grove HOA. There's a suspicious vehicle parked in front of my neighbor's house. It's a black van, no markings, no plates that I can see. I've seen it circling the neighborhood twice this morning. I think they're casing the place. You need to send someone now." Inside the van, Ellie didn't hear Karen's call, but she felt the weight of time pressing down on her. Tom's lips were starting to turn blue, a sign that his oxygen levels were plummeting. She reached for the intubation kit, her movements swift but controlled, as she prepared to secure his airway. "We're not losing you, Tom," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Not today." Chris glanced at her, his expression tense but focused. "How long until we can move him?" "Not yet," Ellie said, her eyes locked on the monitor. "We stabilize him here or he doesn't make it to the hospital." The call that had brought them here had come an hour earlier, when Tom's wearable monitor sent an alert to his daughter, Rachel, who lived 3 states away but kept tabs on her father's health through a remote app. Rachel had been in the middle of a Zoom meeting when the notification popped up on her phone. *critical alert. Heart rate irregular. Blood pressure dropping. Her hands had trembled as she dialed the private emergency line linked to the ICU van, a service she'd signed her father up for after his first heart scare 2 years ago. The van, stationed just outside city limits, had torn through traffic like a missile, weaving through red lights and cutting across lanes to reach the Whitaker house in 5 minutes flat. It was a record, even for them, but every second still felt like an eternity when a heart was failing. What they hadn't accounted for was Karen. She was out in her driveway now, arms crossed, robe flapping in the breeze, her slippers scuffing against the pavement as she glared at the van. To her, it wasn't a lifeline, it was a threat. She'd already decided the people inside were up to no good and nothing was going to change her mind. Not the open back doors revealing medical equipment, not the paramedics in dark uniforms moving with purpose, not even the faint sound of the heart monitor's desperate beeping. Karen's world was black and white, and this van was firmly in the wrong category. "This is outrageous," she snapped, loud enough for her voice to carry across the street. "You can't just park here like this. I've already called the police and they're on their way." Ellie heard her this time, but she didn't look up. Her hands were deep in Tom's chest, performing manual compressions as the monitor showed his heart rhythm faltering. "Chris, get the pads ready," she said, her voice cutting through the beeping like a knife. "We're going to have to shock him." Chris nodded, ripping open a pack of defibrillator pads and placing them on Tom's chest, one below his right collarbone, the other over his left ribs. "Clear," he said, his voice steady as he pressed a button on the AED. The machine whirred, and Tom's body jolted upward, his back arching off the gurney as the shock coursed through him. The monitor blipped, then sputtered back into an erratic rhythm, not stable, but not flatline either. Again, Ellie said, her hands already back on Tom's chest, counting compressions. 1, 2, 3. Karen's voice grew louder, more insistent, as she marched closer to the van, her phone still clutched in one hand. You hear me? The cops are coming. You're not fooling anyone with this setup. I know what you're up to. Chris muttered under his breath, adjusting the oxygen flow to Tom's mask. Lady, you're about to get someone killed. Ellie didn't have time to respond. Her focus was on Tom, on the numbers flashing across the monitor, on the faint pulse she could still feel under her fingers. She'd dealt with bystanders before, panicked family members, curious onlookers, even hostile crowds, but this was different. This wasn't just interference. This was obstruction, and it was coming from the worst possible source, the patient's own wife. Karen, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, planted herself in the middle of the street, arms outstretched like she was forming a human barricade. This is a private neighborhood, she shouted, her voice cracking with righteous fury. We have rules. You can't just roll in here and do whatever you want. I saw you circling earlier. That's casing behavior. Ellie finally snapped, her patience fraying as she glanced up from Tom's gurney. Ma'am, we're in the middle of a medical emergency, she said, her voice flat but laced with steel. This man is going into cardiac arrest. Move. Karen scoffed, her arms still spread wide. Medical emergency? Right. I've seen those scam vans on TikTok. You're just looking for someone to rob. What kind of ambulance doesn't even have flashing lights? The kind that's focused on saving lives, not putting on a show, Chris shot back, his hands still on the oxygen tank. You're delaying a 911 response right now. I'm warning you, Karen shouted, her face flushing red. The police are coming, and you're going to regret this. Ellie's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay focused. Tom's pulse was fading again, his lips now fully blue. She reached for the defibrillator pads, ripping off the protective backing and pressing them back onto his chest. Clear, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. The shock hit, and Tom's body jolted again, the monitor jumping back to life with a weak but persistent rhythm. We're losing time, Chris said, his eyes flicking toward Karen, who was now back on her phone, whispering frantically to the dispatcher. Big black van, no plates, definitely suspicious. There's someone inside, and I think they're being kidnapped. No, I'm not making this up. I'm the neighborhood watch lead. Ellie looked down at Tom, whose eyes fluttered briefly, a sign that he was still fighting. Hang in there, Tom, she said softly, adjusting the Ford drip. We're not letting you go. The irony was suffocating. The man dying on the gurney was Karen's husband, the same man she'd kissed goodbye that morning before he sat down with his coffee and his newspaper. She didn't know it yet, didn't even suspect it, because in her mind, the van was the enemy, and she was the hero. She didn't see the patch on Tom's chest that read Tom W. in faded embroidery, didn't hear the monitors screaming for attention, didn't register the paramedics' urgency as anything other than a performance. To her, this was about protecting her turf, her rules, her neighborhood, and she was willing to risk everything to do it. The van had arrived because of Rachel, Tom's daughter, who'd been monitoring his health remotely since his last heart scare. She'd invested in the wearable monitor, a small device that tracked his vitals and sent alerts to her phone and the ICU van's dispatch system. When the alert came through, she'd called the private emergency line, her voice shaking as she gave the dispatcher her father's address. The van, part of an elite trial program, was designed for exactly this kind of situation. Rapid response, no delays, no excuses. It was equipped with technology that could stabilize a patient on site, buying precious time before they reached a hospital. But no amount of cutting-edge tech could account for a woman like Karen, who saw danger where there was only desperation. Ellie had seen worse in her career, battlefields where bullets flew faster than orders, ERs where patients piled up like cordwood, but this was a new kind of insanity. She'd never had to fight a bystander who was so convinced of their own righteousness that they'd block a life-saving operation. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a liability, and every second she stood in the way was a second Tom didn't have. "Chris, get the crash bag ready," Ellie said, her voice low but urgent. "We might need to intubate again." Chris nodded, pulling the bag from a compartment and unzipping it with a practiced flick of his wrist. "You think she's going to try to physically stop us?" "She's already stopping us," Ellie said, her eyes never leaving Tom. "She just doesn't know it yet." Karen's voice rose again, shrill and unyielding. "You're not going anywhere until the police get here. I know my rights. This is private property." Ellie's hands paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register the absurdity of it all. Private property? Rights? A man was dying, and this woman was quoting HOA bylaws like they were the Constitution. She shook her head, refocusing on Tom, whose chest was barely rising now. "One more shock," she said to Chris. "Then we move him, whether she likes it or not." "Clear," Chris said, pressing the button again. The defibrillator whirred, and Tom's body jerked upward, the monitor blipping back to life with a rhythm that was still weak but holding. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Outside, Karen was oblivious to the battle unfolding inside the van. She stood in her driveway, arms still outstretched, her robe flapping like a flag of defiance. She didn't see the monitors, didn't hear the beeping, didn't know that the man she was married to was fighting for his life just feet away. All she saw was a threat to her authority, and she was determined to squash it. The neighborhood was starting to stir now, curtains twitching as curious neighbors peered out their windows. A few stepped onto their porches, drawn by Karen's shouting and the sight of the mysterious van. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew Karen, and they knew that when she got like this, there was no reasoning with her. She was a force of nature, a hurricane in pink slippers, and she wasn't going to back down until she got her way. But Ellie wasn't backing down either. She'd made a promise to herself when she took this job: no one dies on her watch if she can help it. And Tom Whitaker wasn't going to be the exception, not because of a heart attack and definitely not because of a woman who thought her HOA badge gave her the power to play God. "Chris, start prepping for transport," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "We're getting him out of here, one way or another." Chris nodded, securing the oxygen tank and checking the 4 lines. "What about her?" he asked, jerking his head toward Karen. "Let her call whoever she wants," Ellie said. "She's not stopping us." But Karen was already escalating things. She'd hung up with the dispatcher and was now dialing her friend Linda, the neighborhood's unofficial gossip hub. "Linda, you won't believe this," she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "There's a van parked in front of my house, no markings, no nothing. I've got the police on the way, but you need to tell everyone to lock their doors. This is serious." Inside the van, Ellie adjusted the oxygen mask on Tom's face, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of practice. She didn't know Karen was Tom's wife, didn't know the woman screaming outside was the same one who'd kissed him goodnight the evening before. All she knew was that time was running out, and every second spent dealing with this nonsense was a second stolen from Tom's life. "Pulse is holding," Chris said, his eyes on the monitor. "Fairly. Good enough," Ellie said. "Let's get him ready to roll." But before they could move, the sound of sirens cut through the morning air, sharp and ominous. Karen's face lit up with triumph as 2 black and white cruisers screeched into the cul-de-sac, their lights flashing and tires squealing. The police had arrived, and in Karen's mind, justice was about to be served. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. And Tom, lying on the gurney, his heart stuttering with every passing second, was the one paying the price. The sirens sliced through the morning air like a knife through butter, their wail bouncing off the manicured lawns and cookie-cutter colonials of Pine Grove. The cul-de-sac, moments ago a stage for Karen Whitaker's one-woman crusade against an imagined threat, was now a full-blown circus. Two black and white police cruisers screeched to a halt behind the unmarked black van, their tires leaving faint skid marks on the pristine asphalt. Doors flew open, and 4 officers spilled out, their hands hovering over holsters, eyes scanning the scene with the kind of intensity reserved for bank heists or hostage situations. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the neighborhood in a surreal glow, turning Karen's righteous fury into something far more dangerous, a spectacle that could cost a man his life. Inside the mobile ICU van, Ellie Harper didn't flinch at the sound of the sirens. Her hands were too busy, her focus too razor-sharp, to care about the chaos unfolding outside. Tom Whitaker, her patient, was teetering on the edge of death, his heart rhythm a jagged mess on the monitor. His lips were a sickly shade of blue, his chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Ellie's fingers danced over his sternum, delivering precise compressions as she counted under her breath, her voice a low, steady cadence against the high-pitched beeping of the heart monitor. 1, 2, 3, come on. Tom, stay with me. Chris Delgado, her partner, was crouched beside the gurney, adjusting the defibrillator pads on Tom's chest. His face was taut, his movements quick but controlled, the kind of calm that only comes from years of training and too many close calls. "AD's charged," he said, his voice cutting through the beeping. "Ready when you are." "Clear," Ellie said, her hands lifting off Tom's chest for a split second. The defibrillator whirred, delivering a jolt that made Tom's body arch off the gurney, his limbs twitching like a marionette with cut strings. The monitor blipped, then sputtered back into an erratic rhythm, not stable, not even close, but enough to keep him in the fight. Ellie exhaled, a sharp, controlled breath, and went back to compressions. "Again," she said. "We're not losing him." Outside, Karen stood in the middle of the street, her arms still outstretched like some suburban Moses parting the Red Sea. Her robe flapped in the breeze, her fuzzy pink slippers scuffing against the pavement as she waved her phone like a scepter. "See? I told you," she shouted, her voice shrill with triumph as the officers approached. "They're criminals. I caught them red-handed. That van's been circling all morning, and now they're pretending to be paramedics." The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Daniels with a buzz cut and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his Glock. "Everyone, stay where you are," he barked, his eyes flicking between Karen and the open back doors of the van. "Hands where I can see them." Ellie heard the command, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Tom's pulse was fading again, the monitors beeping growing more frantic by the second. She leaned over him, adjusting the oxygen mask, her hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory and sheer will. "Chris, get the crash bag," she said, her voice low but urgent. "We're going to need AP." Chris nodded, reaching for the bag without missing a beat. But before he could unzip it, Officer Daniels was at the van's back doors, his gun drawn, his stance wide. "Step away from the vehicle," he shouted, his voice booming over the sirens. "No." Ellie's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Daniels for a split second. Her hands were still on Tom, her palms slick with sweat and blood from the foresight. "We're medics," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "This man's in cardiac arrest. We're trying to save his life." Daniels hesitated, his gun still raised, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The van's interior was a chaotic symphony of medical equipment, blinking monitors, hissing oxygen tanks, for bags swaying from a rack. Tom lay strapped to the gurney, his chest exposed, wires and tubes snaking across his body. It was clear this wasn't a kidnapping or a robbery, but Daniels wasn't taking chances. Not with a civilian screaming about suspicious activity and a van that looked nothing like a standard ambulance. "Hands up," he repeated, his voice harder now. "Step out of the vehicle." Ellie's jaw clenched, her patience fraying like a worn rope. "You want me to stop CPR?" she snapped, her hands still pumping Tom's chest. Because if I do, he's dead in 30 seconds. Your call. The second officer, a younger woman named Officer Ruiz, stepped closer, her gun still drawn, but her expression less certain. She glanced at Karen, who was now nodding vigorously, her arms folded across her chest like she'd just won a debate. They're lying, Karen shouted. I saw this on TikTok. Scam vans like this pretend to be medical to get into houses. They don't even have flashing lights. Chris, still crouched by the gurney, muttered under his breath, Lady, you're killing your own husband. He didn't look up, his hands busy checking the 4-line, but the frustration in his voice was palpable. Daniels took a step closer, his gun still trained on Ellie. Ma'am, I need you to step out and show me some ID. Now. Ellie didn't budge. Her hands kept moving, her eyes locked on Tom's monitor. My ID's in my pocket, she said, her voice flat but laced with steel. You want it? You come get it. But I'm not stopping. This man's heart stopped twice already, and you're wasting time we don't have. The standoff hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and electric. The sirens wailed, the neighbors watched from their porches, and Karen stood there, smug as ever, convinced she'd saved the day. She didn't see the monitors, didn't hear the beeping, didn't know that the man on the gurney was Tom Whitaker, her husband of 20 years, the same man she'd argued with over the thermostat that morning. To her, this was about rules, about order, about protecting her little fiefdom from outsiders. And she was willing to let the world burn to prove she was right. Ruiz lowered her gun slightly, her eyes flicking to Daniels. Sarge, this looks legit, she said, her voice quieter now. That's a heart monitor. They're doing CPR. Daniels didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, peering into the van, his gun still raised, but his finger off the trigger. The scene inside was undeniable, medical gear in mid-use, a patient strapped to a gurney, 2 paramedics working with the kind of urgency that doesn't come from acting. But Karen's voice cut through again, sharp and insistent. Don't let them fool you, she shouted, marching closer to the van. I'm the neighborhood watch lead. I know what I saw. They're trying to kidnap someone. I heard them talking about moving him. Ellie's hands paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register the absurdity of it all. Kidnapping? This woman was so far gone she thought a mobile ICU was a criminal front. She shook her head, refocusing on Tom, whose pulse was fading again. Chris, 8B now, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Chris grabbed a syringe from the crash bag, drawing up a dose of epinephrine with practiced speed. Got it, he said, injecting it into the 4-line. The monitor blipped, Tom's rhythm stuttering but holding, barely. Daniels finally lowered his gun, his eyes narrowing as he took in the full scene. Ma'am, he said, turning to Karen, step back. Now. Karen blinked, her smug expression faltering for the first time. What? I'm the one who called you. They're the problem. Step back, Daniels repeated, his voice like gravel. He turned to Ruiz, nodding toward the van. Check it out. Ruiz holstered her gun and climbed into the van, her eyes scanning the equipment. She froze when she saw Tom's face, pale and sunken, his chest wired with electrodes. Sarge, she said, her voice tight. That's Tom Whitaker, my dad's fishing buddy. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Daniel's posture shifted, his gun dropping to his side as he processed what Ruiz had just said. Whitaker, he repeated, his eyes flicking to Karen. As in, your husband? Karen's face went pale, her arms falling to her sides. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That can't be right. Ellie didn't look up, but her voice was ice cold. It's him. And you're wasting time we don't have. Move. The realization crashed over Karen like a tidal wave, but it didn't stop her from doubling down. I didn't know, she blurted, her voice cracking. I thought they were criminals. The van doesn't even look like an ambulance. Chris snapped, his patience gone. It's not supposed to. It's a mobile ICU, lady. We're saving your husband's life, and you're calling us kidnappers. Daniels stepped between Karen and the van, his hand raised to silence her. Enough, he said, his voice low but commanding. He turned to Ellie, his expression softening slightly. What do you need? Hospital backup, Ellie said without missing a beat. Now, he's crashing again. As if on cue, the monitor let out a piercing wail, Tom's rhythm flatlining for the third time that morning. Ellie's hands flew back to his chest, resuming compressions with a force that made her arms ache. Clear, she shouted, nodding to Chris. Chris hit the defibrillator button, and Tom's body jolted again, the monitor jumping back to life with a weak, erratic blip. We've got a rhythm, he said, his voice tight with relief. But it's not going to hold long. Daniels was already on his radio, barking orders to the other officers. Get an escort to County General now. Clear the route. We've got a critical patient. The other two officers, who'd been standing by the cruisers, sprang into action, jumping back into their vehicles and flipping on the sirens. Ruiz stayed by the van, her eyes wide as she watched Ellie and Chris work. How can I help? She asked, her voice shaky but earnest. Keep her out of the way, Ellie said, nodding toward Karen, who was now standing frozen in the street, her phone dangling limply in her hand. Karen's face was a mask of shock and denial, her eyes darting between the van and the officers. I didn't know, she repeated, her voice trembling now. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. Protect? Ellie snapped, her hands still pumping Tom's chest. You called the cops on a medical emergency. You nearly got a shot, and you're still talking about the neighborhood. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked at Daniels, then at Ruiz, then back at the van, her world crumbling under the weight of her own mistake. But even now, she couldn't let go of her narrative. The van, it didn't have lights, she stammered. It looked suspicious. Suspicious, Chris said, his voice dripping with disbelief. You saw us doing CPR. You saw the monitors. What part of that screams suspicious to you? Daniels cut in, his patience gone. Ma'am, you need to step aside. You've done enough. Karen flinched, her face crumpling as the reality of her actions began to sink in. But she didn't move, not yet. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her robe flapping in the breeze, her slippers absurdly out of place in the chaos. The neighbors were watching now, their phones out, recording the scene from their porches and windows. A few whispered to each other, their voices low but audible. That's Karen. She called the cops on an ambulance? Is that Tom in there? She's lost it this time. Inside the van, Ellie and Chris were in a race against time. Tom's rhythm was holding, but barely, and every second spent arguing with Karen or placating the police was a second he didn't have. Ellie adjusted the Ford drip, her fingers moving with the kind of speed that only comes from desperation. We need to move him, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. He's not going to make it if we stay here. Chris nodded, securing the oxygen tank and checking the straps on the gurney. Hospital's 10 minutes out with an escort. We can do this. Ellie glanced at Daniels, who was still standing by the van's doors, his radio crackling with updates from the other officers. You're clearing the path? She asked, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Already on it, Daniels said, his voice firm. You've got a straight shot to County General. We'll lead the way. Good, Ellie said, her eyes back on Tom. Because we're out of time. The van's engine roared to life as Chris climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. Ellie stayed in the back, her hands never leaving Tom, her eyes glued to the monitor. The gurney was secured, the equipment locked down, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Tom's life hung by a thread, and every pothole, every red light, every second of delay could snap it. Daniels stepped back, waving the other officers into position. Let's move, he shouted, his voice carrying over the sirens. The cruisers pulled out, their lights flashing, their sirens howling as they cleared the cul-de-sac. The van followed, its tires squealing as Chris floored the gas, the vehicle lurching forward with a force that rattled the equipment inside. Karen stood alone in the street now, her arms limp, her phone still clutched in her hand. She watched the van pull away, the police cruisers leading the way, and for the first time that morning, she felt the weight of what she'd done. But even now, she couldn't fully grasp it. She turned to the neighbors, her voice weak but defiant. "I didn't know it was him," she said, as if that excused everything. "I was just trying to keep us safe." No one responded. The neighbors turned away, their phones still recording, their whispers growing louder. Karen's reputation, once a badge of pride in Pine Grove, was unraveling faster than she could comprehend. And as the van sped toward the hospital, carrying her husband's fading life, she was left standing in the wreckage of her own making. Inside the van, Ellie's world was a blur of monitors and motion. The sirens outside were a distant hum, the flashing lights a faint glow through the tinted windows. Her hands were on Tom, her eyes on the numbers flashing across the screen. His heart rate was dropping again, his blood pressure tanking. She grabbed the crash bag, pulling out another syringe of epinephrine, her fingers shaking slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Stay with me, Tom," she said, her voice low but fierce. "We're almost there." Chris glanced back from the driver's seat, his eyes flicking to the monitor. 5 minutes out, he said, his voice tight. "Cops are clearing the intersections." "Good," Ellie said, injecting the epinephrine into the 4-line. "Because he's not giving us 5 minutes." The monitor wailed again, Tom's rhythm flatlining for the 4th time. Ellie's hands flew to his chest, resuming compressions with a force that made her shoulders burn. "Clear," she shouted, nodding to the defibrillator. Chris reached back, hitting the button from the driver's seat, his eyes never leaving the road. The shock hit, and Tom's body jolted, the monitor jumping back to life with a weak, stuttering rhythm. "We've got him," Ellie said, her voice hoarse but resolute. Barely. The van sped through the streets, the police cruisers parting traffic like water. Intersections cleared, red lights ignored, the world bending to the urgency of the moment. But inside the van, it felt like a hurricane, every second a battle to keep Tom's heart beating. Ellie's hands never stopped, her eyes never wavered, her focus a lifeline in the chaos. And somewhere behind them, Karen stood alone, her world collapsing under the weight of a mistake she couldn't undo. The sirens faded, the van disappeared, and the neighborhood watched, their phones capturing every second of a tragedy that was only just beginning to unfold. The mobile ICU van tore through the streets of Pine Grove, its tires humming against the asphalt as the police cruisers carved a path through morning traffic. The sirens wailed, a piercing cry that parted cars like the Red Sea, their red and blue lights flashing in sync with the urgency of the moment. Inside the van, the world was a blur of beeping monitors, hissing oxygen tanks, and the relentless rhythm of Ellie Harper's hands on Tom Whitaker's chest. Tom's heart was a stubborn flicker, clinging to life through sheer force of will and the skill of the paramedics fighting to keep him alive. His face was pale, his lips still tinged blue, but the monitor showed a weak, erratic rhythm, a fragile thread that Ellie refused to let snap. Ellie's dark uniform was streaked with sweat, her short-cropped hair damp against her forehead as she adjusted the 4 drip with one hand and monitored the heart rate with the other. Her eyes were locked on the screen, every blip a small victory, every dip a warning. "Come on, Tom," she muttered, her voice low but fierce. "You're tougher than this." Chris Delgado, behind the wheel, kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The police escort was doing its job, clearing intersections and forcing drivers to pull over, but every pothole, every sharp turn, felt like a personal affront to the delicate balance in the back of the van. 3 minutes out, he called over his shoulder, his voice tight with focus. "Hospitals prepped and waiting." "Good," Ellie said, her hands never pausing. She reached for the crash bag, pulling out a syringe of atropine, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that comes from years of high-stakes emergencies. Tom's heart rate was dipping into dangerous bradycardia again, and she wasn't taking chances. "Hang in there," she said, injecting the medication into the 4-line. "We're almost home." Back in Pine Grove, the cul-de-sac was still buzzing with the aftershock of Karen Whitaker's catastrophic mistake. Neighbors stood on their porches, phones in hand, recording the fading taillights of the van and the police cruisers. Whispers spread like wildfire, each voice adding fuel to the growing scandal. Karen called the cops on an ambulance? That was Tom in there, her own husband. She's gone too far this time. The footage was already making its way to group chats and social media, a grainy video of Karen blocking the driveway, screaming about kidnappers while paramedics fought to save a life. It was the kind of thing that could ruin a reputation in hours, and Karen's was already on life support. At County General Hospital, the ER bay was a hive of controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency, their radios crackling with updates from the incoming ICU van. The trauma team was already assembled, gurneys prepped, crash carts at the ready. The hospital's real-time sync with the van system had given them a head start. Vitals, medications, timestamps, all streaming in as Ellie and Chris raced through the streets. The lead physician, Dr. Javier Morales, a seasoned trauma specialist with graying temples and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood at the bay doors, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the horizon for the van's arrival. "They're cutting it close," Morales muttered to a nurse beside him, his voice low but steady. "Cardiac arrest, multiple flatlines, and a police standoff? This guy's lucky to still have a pulse." The nurse, a young woman named Sarah with a clipboard and a calm efficiency, nodded. "Mobile ICU's been on him the whole way. If anyone can pull this off, it's Harper." Morales grunted, his expression unreadable. He'd seen too many cases go south to be optimistic, but he trusted Ellie's team. The ICU on Wheels program was new, controversial, and wildly expensive, but it had already saved lives that traditional ambulances couldn't reach in time. Today, though, it was facing its toughest test yet, not just medically, but politically. A civilian calling the cops on a government-backed pilot? That was the kind of PR nightmare that could kill a program before it even got off the ground. The van screeched into the ER bay, its tires squealing as Chris slammed on the brakes. The back doors flew open before the vehicle fully stopped, and Ellie was already shouting vitals as she and Chris unstrapped Tom's gurney. Male, 62, cardiac arrest, 4 flatlines, last shock 2 minutes ago, AP and atropine on board, rhythm unstable. Her voice was a rapid-fire checklist, every word precise despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The trauma team descended like a well-oiled machine, transferring Tom to a hospital gurney with a speed that blurred the lines between chaos and choreography. Nurses hooked him to new monitors, doctors barked orders, and Morales took over, his hands moving with the same urgency Ellie had shown in the van. "Get him to triage," he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "We're cracking the crash cart." Ellie stayed by the gurney as they wheeled Tom through the automatic doors, her eyes never leaving his face. She rattled off the rest of the history: time of onset, medications administered, the 7-minute delay caused by the police intervention. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes, a barely contained fury at the woman who'd nearly derailed everything. "Neighbor called it in as a kidnapping," she said, her tone clipped. "Cops had guns on us while we were doing CPR." Morales didn't look up, his hands busy intubating Tom. "You're kidding," he said, his voice flat but laced with disbelief. "Wish I was," Ellie said, stepping back as the team took over. "File's going to need a note on that." Sarah, the nurse, scribbled furiously on her clipboard, her face a mask of professionalism despite the absurdity of the situation. "Police intervention during CPR," she muttered, shaking her head. "That's a new one." Chris, still by the van, let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging for the first time in over 30 minutes. He leaned against the door, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. "There's always a Karen," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Always. Inside the hospital, Tom's fight was far from over. The trauma team rushed him through the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the sterile tiles. Halfway to triage, the monitor wailed again, Tom's heart flatlining for the 5th time that morning. Morales cursed under his breath, grabbing the crash cart and ripping open a pack of defibrillator pads. "Clear," he shouted, his voice booming as the team stepped back. The shock hit, and Tom's body jolted, the monitor jumping back to life with a weak, stuttering rhythm. "He shouldn't even be alive right now," Morales said, his voice low as he adjusted the oxygen line. "Whatever you two did in that van, you bought him just enough time." Ellie nodded, her eyes still on the gurney as it disappeared into the triage bay. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. The weight of the morning was written in the lines on her face, the blood on her gloves, the sweat soaking through her uniform. She turned to Sarah, her voice steady but firm. "Make sure that note about the delay goes in the file. 7 minutes. Could have been the difference." Sarah nodded, her pen still moving. "Got it. I'll flag it for the report." Outside in the waiting room, the chaos of Pine Grove was about to collide with the sterile order of the hospital. Karen Whitaker arrived 10 minutes after the van, her face red and blotchy, her breath coming in short, indignant gasps. She'd driven herself, her robe swapped for a hastily thrown-on sweater and yoga pants, but the fuzzy pink slippers remained, absurd reminder of the morning's absurdity. She marched up to the reception desk, her palms slamming down on the counter with a force that made the receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Linda, flinch. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge," Karen snapped, her voice loud enough to turn heads in the waiting room. "I'm Tom Whitaker's wife, and I've been completely left in the dark. I have rights." Linda didn't blink, her expression a mask of professional calm. "Ma'am, the patient is in critical condition. No visitors right now. Please take a seat." Karen's face twisted, her indignation flaring like a match. "A seat? Are you serious? That's my husband in there. I want a list of everyone who touched him, names, departments, certifications. That van wasn't even marked properly. I still think this whole thing is shady." Linda's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a cold, cutting edge. "Ma'am, that shady van just saved your husband's life. You made a false report during a medical emergency, and it nearly killed him. The paramedics had to stop CPR to put their hands up for the police. You want someone to blame? Start with a mirror." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The waiting room was silent now, every pair of eyes on her, their expressions ranging from disgust to disbelief. A man in a corner chair coughed, muttering "unbelievable" under his breath. A woman with a toddler on her lap shook her head, her lips pursed in silent judgment. Karen's face flushed deeper, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse, but she didn't back down. "Not yet. I didn't know it was him," she said, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. I thought they were criminals. There've been break-ins lately. The neighborhood's been on edge." Linda didn't budge, her voice unrelenting. "You saw paramedics working. You saw medical equipment. You chose to ignore it. Take a seat, ma'am." Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found none. She muttered something unintelligible and slunk to a corner chair, her arms crossed, her face a mask of wounded pride. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen, but she didn't dial. Not yet. The weight of the room's judgment was too heavy, the sting of Linda's words too sharp. In the ICU observation room, Ellie stood with Morales, her arms folded, her eyes locked on Tom through the glass. He was stable for now, his chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator, tubes snaking from his arms and mouth. Machines hummed around him, their steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos of the morning. Morales crossed his arms, his expression grim. "How long until full trauma response teams are on wheels like yours?" he asked, his voice low. "Not soon enough," Ellie said, her tone flat but resolute. "Today was the first real stress test in a suburban zone. We passed, but it was too close." "It wasn't the medicine that nearly cost him," Morales said, his eyes flicking to her. "It was ignorance." Ellie nodded, her jaw tight. "She's down there now, trying to spin it like she's the victim." "I heard her at the desk." Morales snorted, shaking his head. "Some people can't see past their own noses." "You file that report yet?" "Working on it," Ellie said, pulling out her clipboard. 7-minute delay, weapons drawn, civilian obstruction. "It's all going in." "Good," Morales said. "This program's on thin ice as it is. One bad headline, and the suits upstairs will pull the plug." Ellie didn't respond, her eyes still on Tom. She knew the stakes. The ICU on Wheels program was a gamble, expensive, unorthodox, and a lightning rod for critics who thought it was overkill. But it worked, and Tom was proof. If Karen's call hadn't derailed them, they might have stabilized him sooner, maybe even avoided that fifth flatline. The thought made her stomach churn, a mix of anger and exhaustion that she pushed down with a deep breath. Downstairs, Karen was stewing in her corner chair, her phone now open to the neighborhood group chat. She typed furiously, her fingers shaking as she tried to reclaim control of the narrative. "There was a misunderstanding this morning. A suspicious van parked in front of my house, no markings, no lights. I called the police to protect our community. Turns out it was a medical thing, but how was I supposed to know?" She hit send, her heart pounding, but the responses were immediate and brutal. "Karen, you called the cops on an ambulance? That was Tom in there. Your own husband. You need to step down. This is embarrassing." The chat exploded, neighbors piling on with a ferocity that caught Karen off guard. She scrolled through the messages, her face paling with each one. A notification popped up, a video uploaded to X by someone across the street. It showed her blocking the driveway, screaming into her phone, then arguing with the police as they approached with guns drawn. The moment Officer Ruiz recognized Tom on the gurney was frozen in slow motion, the caption reading, "Neighborhood Karen calls cops on husband's ambulance." Yikes. The post had 10,000 views in 20 minutes, and the comments were savage. "CPR Karen strikes again. Imagine dying because your wife thinks she's smarter than a medic." "HOA tyrant finally gets what's coming." Karen's hands trembled as she scrolled, her breath hitching. She tried to type a response, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The waiting room was still watching her, their whispers now audible. "That's her," a woman said to her husband, not bothering to lower her voice. "The one from the video." Karen's phone buzzed again, this time a call from Rachel, Tom's daughter. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen, but she answered, her voice shaky. "Rachel, sweetheart, I didn't know what was happening." "Karen, shut up." Rachel's voice sliced through the speaker, cold and unyielding. "I got the alert. I watched the GPS feed. I saw your name on the police report. You called the cops on the only people saving Dad's life. I thought it was a scam." Karen protested, her voice rising. "The van didn't have lights. There've been break-ins." "You didn't think," Rachel snapped. "You acted like you always do, like you're the queen of the neighborhood. If Dad doesn't make it, you're never stepping into my life again. Don't even come to the funeral." The line went dead, leaving Karen staring at her phone, her world collapsing around her. Across the room, a teenager with earbuds glanced up, his phone angled toward Karen. She caught his eye, and he quickly looked away, but not before she realized he was recording her. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The air in the waiting room had shifted, a palpable sense of judgment that made her skin crawl. She sank deeper into her chair, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the fish tank across the room, where neon tetras swam in dizzying loops. For the first time in years, Karen felt small, exposed, and utterly alone. Back in the ICU, Tom's condition was stabilizing, but the road ahead was long. The trauma team had managed to restore a steady rhythm, but his heart was weak, his body battered from the repeated shocks and compressions. Tubes ran from his arms, his mouth, his chest, each one a lifeline keeping him tethered to the world. Ellie stood by the glass, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her eyes tracing the lines on his face. He looked older now, frilier, but there was a stubbornness in the way his chest rose and fell, a refusal to let go. Morales joined her, his hands in his pockets, his expression softer now. "You did good out there," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Most teams would have cracked under that kind of pressure. Ellie shrugged, her eyes still on Tom. "We trained for it. Doesn't make it easier." "No," Morales agreed. "But it makes it possible. You bought him time. That's what counts." Ellie nodded, but the fire in her eyes hadn't cooled. She was thinking about Karen, about the 7-minute delay, about the guns pointed at her while she was trying to save a life. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, a failure of empathy so profound it made her question the world they were fighting for. "She's still out there," she said, her voice low, trying to justify it. "Let her," Morales said. "The world's already judging her. You saw the video." Ellie's lips twitched, a faint, humorless smile. "Hard to miss. It's everywhere." The video had gone viral in a matter of hours, racking up millions of views across X, TikTok, and every news outlet with a social media account. The footage was damning: Karen's shrill voice, her outstretched arms, the police with guns drawn, the moment of realization when Ruiz recognized Tom. The internet had dubbed her CPR Karen, a nickname that stuck like glue, spawning memes, hashtags, and late-night talk show jokes. "Neighborhood watch" or "neighborhood wrecker." One comment read, "This is why HOAs are the worst," said another. The outrage was universal, a rare moment of online unity in a world that thrived on division. The hospital's PR team was already scrambling, fielding calls from reporters camped outside the ER. They wanted interviews, photos, anything to feed the growing frenzy. Rachel, still at her father's side, declined every request, her focus on Tom and nothing else. But she didn't stop others from talking. She knew the more people saw what Karen had done, the more likely it was that programs like the ICU van would get the funding and support they needed. If Karen's downfall was the price, so be it. Ellie, meanwhile, was back in the van, cleaning equipment and logging trauma data. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Chris handed her a protein bar, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Fine," Ellie said, tearing open the wrapper. "Just pissed." "Join the club," Chris said, leaning against the van's door. "You think she even gets it? What she almost caused?" Ellie shook her head, her eyes on the clipboard in her lap. "No, she's too busy playing victim. But the world's not letting her off easy." The world, indeed, was relentless. The video had caught the attention of emergency medical associations, with one California trauma surgeon reposting it with a single word: unreal. Local news stations were running it on loop, their anchors shaking their heads in disbelief. An open letter from a Pine Grove neighbor, titled "When Rules Kill," was pinned to the community bulletin board, next to a petition for Karen's removal from the HOA board. It had 47 signatures in less than a day, out of 52 homes, a damning verdict from a neighborhood that had once feared her. Karen, oblivious to the petition, was still in the waiting room, her phone now tucked away, her eyes fixed on the fish tank. She hadn't moved in hours, hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked at the other people in the room. But the whispers followed her, the stares burned, and the weight of her actions pressed down like a physical force. She tried to call Linda, her friend from the neighborhood, but the call went to voicemail. She texted the HOA group chat again, but the responses were cold, dismissive, or outright hostile. Even her allies, The ones who'd once cheered her crackdowns on unapproved mailboxes were silent. The hospital staff, meanwhile, were buzzing with their own version of the story. Nurses swapped details in the break room, doctors muttered about it over coffee, and the security team had to turn away 3 news vans trying to sneak in for a photo of Tom. The narrative was clear. Ellie and Chris were heroes, the ICU van was a game changer, and Karen was the villain who nearly ruined it all. It was a simple story, one that fit neatly into the internet's outrage machine, and it was spreading faster than anyone could control. Ellie, back in the observation room, watched Tom through the glass, her clipboard now filled with notes for the incident report. She'd written every detail, the timeline, the delay, the police intervention, Karen's obstruction. It wasn't just for the hospital, it was for the program, for the next time someone tried to shut it down over budget cuts or bad press. She knew how fragile the pilot was, how one wrong move could end it. Karen's call had nearly been that move, and Ellie wasn't going to let it happen again. Morales joined her again, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on Tom. "You think he'll pull through?" he asked, his voice quiet. "He's a fighter," Ellie said, her tone resolute. "He's got to be after all this." Morales nodded, his expression softening. "You ever think about what you'd do if this program gets canned?" Ellie's jaw tightened, her eyes still on Tom. "I'd fight for it. Same as I fought for him." Morales didn't argue. He knew she meant it. The ICU on Wheels program wasn't just a job for Ellie. It was a mission, a lifeline for people like Tom who didn't have time to wait for traditional ambulances. Karen's ignorance had nearly cost them everything, but it had also shone a spotlight on the program, and Ellie was determined to make that count. Downstairs, Karen finally stood, her legs shaky as she approached the reception desk again. Linda was still there, her expression unchanged. "Any update?" Karen asked, her voice small now, almost pleading. "He's stable," Linda said, her tone flat. "No visitors. You'll be notified if that changes." Karen nodded, her eyes welling up. I didn't mean for this to happen." Linda didn't respond, her eyes flicking back to her computer. Karen turned away, her shoulders slumped, and walked back to her chair. The waiting room was emptier now, but the judgment lingered, a silent accusation that followed her every step. She sat down, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in her life, Karen Whitaker had nothing to say. And in the ICU, Tom's heart kept beating, a stubborn rhythm against the odds, a testament to the paramedics who refused to give up, and a reminder of the woman who nearly stopped them. The world was watching now, and Karen's reckoning was only just beginning. The morning Tom Whitaker came home, the air in Pine Grove felt different, like the neighborhood had shed a layer of its polished veneer and was breathing for the first time in years. Gone were the passive-aggressive HOA flyers taped to mailboxes, the whispers about unapproved lawn ornaments, the suffocating weight of Karen Whitaker's reign. The cul-de-sac, once a battleground for her petty crusades, now hummed with a cautious hope, a quiet unity forged in the aftermath of a near tragedy. The sun hung low, casting golden shadows across manicured lawns, and the neighbors, usually hidden behind their curtains, stepped outside to watch. Some waved, others nodded, a few even clapped as the mobile ICU van glided into the Whitaker driveway, its black exterior no longer a symbol of suspicion, but a beacon of survival. Tom was awake, propped up on the gurney with a soft neck pillow, his face pale, but alive with a thin smile that hinted at a strength he was only beginning to reclaim. Wires still peeked out from under his shirt, a portable monitor beeping gently by his side, but he was here, back where he belonged, against all odds. Ellie Harper steered the gurney with steady hands, her dark uniform worn but proud, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of gratitude and defiance. Chris Delgado walked beside her, carrying Tom's medication bag and a clipboard with discharge instructions, his usual smirk replaced by a quiet resolve. This wasn't standard protocol. The ICU team didn't typically do home drop-offs. But Rachel, Tom's daughter, had asked, and Ellie had agreed without hesitation. After everything, she wanted to be the one to wheel Tom into the house he'd nearly left forever. It felt like closing a circle, sealing a victory that had cost too much to win. The neighbors watched, their phones tucked away for once, their expressions soft with something that hadn't been there before: gratitude. A woman across the street, who'd once rolled her eyes at Karen's HOA meetings, held up a small sign that read, "Welcome home, Tom. We've got your back." A kid 3 houses down, no older than 10, stood on his porch with a crayon-drawn card clutched in his hands. The words, "Feel better, Mr. Tom," scrawled in uneven letters. The gesture hit Ellie harder than she expected, a reminder of why she did this job, why she fought through the chaos and the Karens of the world to save lives. Tom's hand twitched, gesturing weakly toward the crowd as the gurney rolled up a temporary ramp installed over the porch steps. "More people than I expected," he said, his voice gravelly but steady, each word a small triumph over the heart that had betrayed him. Ellie smiled, her eyes flicking to the neighbors. "Word spreads fast," she said, "especially when it involves ambulances, defibrillators, and a YouTube clip with 3 million views." Tom chuckled, then winced, his hand brushing his chest. "Still hurts when I laugh," he said, "which is annoying because this whole thing is absurd." "Absurd's one way to put it," Chris muttered, adjusting the medication bag. "Miracle's another." They rolled Tom into the living room, where Rachel had transformed the space into a recovery haven. A medical bed sat by the window, flanked by an oxygen tank and a stack of clean sheets. A table nearby was piled with cards, some from friends, others from strangers who'd seen the viral video and felt compelled to write. One, from the kid down the street, had a drawing of a heart with a band-aid on it, the words "Sorry your heart got mad" written in red crayon. Tom reached for it, his fingers trembling as he held it up. "This," he said, his voice soft, "this is what matters." Ellie nodded, her throat tight. "This is why we do what we do." Rachel ushered them toward the kitchen, where a pot of coffee was brewing, its aroma cutting through the faint smell of lemon disinfectant that lingered in the house. The space was spotless, every surface gleaming, a testament to Rachel's determination to make her father's return perfect. On the fridge, a collage of printouts told the story of the past week, emails from strangers praising the ICU team, a screen grab of Ellie's press conference, a news article titled, "The Van That Saved a Life and Shamed a Neighborhood." One headline, from a satire site, read, "Woman calls cops on husband's CPR, claims EMTs were acting suspiciously alive." It was a bitter jab, but Ellie couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. The world had seen Karen for what she was, and it wasn't letting her forget. Over coffee, Rachel's voice dropped, her eyes flicking to the living room where a nurse was settling Tom into the medical bed. "She wants to talk to him," she said, her tone heavy with disdain. "Karen called this morning. Said she didn't want to come here, but she wanted to say something. I told her she could show up in person or not at all." Ellie set her cup down, her jaw tightening. "You think he wants that?" Rachel's eyes darkened, her voice like ice. "I think he wants it finished. On his terms." An hour later, the knock came, soft but unmistakable. Karen stood on the porch, clutching a small bag with a plastic container inside. Cookies, probably, a feeble attempt at atonement. She looked smaller than she had in the cul-de-sac, her energy drained, her hair unstyled, her face hollow. Her eyes avoided Rachel's as the door opened, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for a blow. "He's in the living room," Rachel said, her voice flat, stepping aside without offering a welcome. Karen walked in like she was trespassing, her step slow, her hands clutching the bag like a shield. When she saw Tom, she stopped short, her breath catching. He was half upright in the medical bed, one arm resting on a folded towel, his eyes open and calm but unreadable. The monitor beside him beeped steadily, a quiet reminder of how close he'd come to silence. "I brought you these," Karen said, holding out the bag, her voice trembling. Tom didn't reach for it. "Why?" he asked, his voice low, each word deliberate. Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking to the floor. "Because I'm sorry," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I didn't know it was you. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I thought the van was dangerous. I panicked." Tom was quiet, his eyes fixed on her, the monitor's steady beep filling the silence. "Do you know what it felt like?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "To hear your voice screaming outside, when I was flat on my back, unable to breathe. I heard you yelling about criminals, about rules, and I thought, she'll never let them help me." Karen's lips trembled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean." "I know exactly what you meant," Tom interrupted, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You meant your suspicion was more important than logic. You meant your fear was more urgent than my life. You didn't ask questions. You didn't wait. You acted, and it nearly ended me." Karen's hands shook, the bag crinkling in her grip. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "So did they," Tom said, nodding toward Ellie, who stood by the door, her arms crossed, her eyes hard. "The difference is, their right thing saved me." Karen looked at the floor, silent, her tears falling faster now. She placed the bag on the side table, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was trying to hold herself together. She turned to leave, but Tom's voice stopped her. "You want to make it right?" he asked, his tone softer now, but no less firm. She turned, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Step down from the HO," Tom said. "And volunteer at the hospital, not on a board, not in charge. At a desk, in scrubs, in silence. Learn what it means to help without control." Karen nodded, her voice steady for the first time. "Okay," she said, and walked out, the door closing behind her like a final chapter. Later that evening, Ellie and Chris sat outside the van, parked across the street from the Whitaker house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the neighborhood quiet except for the faint hum of crickets. Chris leaned back against the van's door, his arms folded, a protein bar half-eaten in his hand. "You think she meant it?" he asked, his voice low. "I think she's shaken enough to try," Ellie said, her eyes on the house. "But if she doesn't, the internet's got her number. It doesn't forget." Chris smirked, taking a bite of the bar. "Best part of this whole mess? The program's sticking around. City just approved full integration. We're not going anywhere." Ellie's lips curved into a rare smile, her eyes glinting with quiet triumph. "Good. This neighborhood needs a reminder parked right in front of them." Chris raised an eyebrow. "What's next, boss?" "Same as always," Ellie said, her voice steady, resolute. "Answer the call. Ignore the noise. Hope the next Karen stays in her lane." As the porch light flicked on and Tom's faint laughter echoed through the open window, the van's engine purred to life, its black silhouette a silent promise against the twilight. The neighbors watched it pull away, their faces soft with respect, their whispers now ones of admiration. The ICU van wasn't just a vehicle. It was a lifeline, a defiance of death, a middle finger to the ignorance that had nearly won. And as it rolled out of Pine Grove, ready for its next mission, it carried a truth that would echo far beyond the cul-de-sac. Not all heroes wear capes. Some drive unmarked vans, and they don't stop, not for fear, not for rules, not for anyone. The fallout from that morning didn't end with Karen's quiet exit. 3 days later, the HOA board held its meeting in the community clubhouse, every chair filled for the first time in years. Even the apathetic neighbors, the ones who'd skipped meetings to avoid Karen's lectures, showed up, their faces set with purpose. Karen sat at the front table, her shoulders stiff, her jaw clenched, her usual air of authority replaced by a brittle silence. The petition to remove her from the board was read aloud, 47 signatures laid bare like a public execution. When they asked if she had a final statement, she stood, her eyes scanning the room, but said nothing. She walked out, the door's thud echoing like a gavel, and the board voted unanimously to strip her of her title. Across town, the viral video of CPR Karen had exploded beyond Pine Grove, racking up over 10 million views in a week. National news outlets picked it up, framing it as a cautionary tale about paranoia and entitlement, while emergency medical associations hailed the ICU van as the future of trauma care. The program's funding, once on shaky ground, was now secure, with cities across the state requesting their own units. Ellie's press conference, her steely words about fear shouting louder than fact, became a rallying cry for first responders, shared and retweeted by those who'd faced their own Karens in the field. Karen, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Her house sat shuttered, blinds drawn, curtains closed, as if she could block out the world's judgment. Neighbors whispered she was too ashamed to show her face, and the HOA board, now led by a soft-spoken retiree named Linda, began dismantling the draconian rules Karen had championed. The community first flyers, once plastered across notice boards, were quietly peeled away, replaced by a new sign: Pine Grove, where neighbors come first. Tom's recovery was slow but steady, each day a step closer to the life he'd nearly lost. Rachel stayed by his side, her fierce love a shield against the chaos Karen had unleashed. When Tom finally spoke of his wife, it was with a quiet resolve, a determination to move forward without her shadow. He wrote a letter to Ellie, his shaky handwriting a testament to his fight. "Thank you for not stopping, even when the world tried to." Ellie kept it in her vest pocket, a reminder of why she'd never give up, no matter the odds. And so, Pine Grove changed. The neighborhood that had once bowed to Karen's whims became a place of quiet resilience, where neighbors checked on each other, where kids drew cards for strangers, where a black van was no longer a threat but a promise. The ICU team rolled on, their mission unshaken, their resolve forged in the fire of that chaotic morning. They were the unsung, the relentless, the ones who answered the call when the world screamed to stop. And as the stars blinked on above the cul-de-sac, their legacy burned brighter than any siren, a beacon for a world that needed heroes more than ever, not in capes, but in unmarked vans, racing against time, against ignorance, against the darkness that threatened to win. They were the heartbeat of hope, and they would never, ever stop.